Chapter 5 Doyle the Pyro. A scream tore Marlowe back to reality in his dark hut. Then a whizzing noise, faint but growing louder, came up from the south. An orange flash beamed through the gaps in the walls, and an explosion consumed a hut right outside. People came running out into the street, hollering as the fire grew out of control. He got up from his spot, heart pounding, and reached for the door. It fell in against the wall. He stepped around it and bounded outside. Fire climbed up the hut across the way. Sparked daggers ate up its thatched roof in seconds. Doused skittered around the pyre like frenzied ants with buckets filled with water and sand, tossing them onto the blaze. Their shadows flickered out in the blue nighttime as the fire roared and tripled in size. Sparks settled next door, lighting that one up too. Smoke hissed at the villagers, swooping and choking them. Some of them fell and dropped full buckets of water that the sand sucked up in seconds. A fireball zipped over Marlowe's head and struck the sand beside his hut, turning grit into glass. He took cover behind the wall. Out in the dark, figures came closer, conjuring double-handed flames, bleeding orange tracers as they moved through the night. They threw more. 3 bolts flew past him. The first couple missed, singeing the air, but the last hit the edge of his hut and started gobbling up the roof. He reached for a fistful of sand and tossed it at the flame. It hissed. He threw another. Its tendrils retreated, leaving smoke. The figures vanished when he looked back. The doused had almost put out the other fires. Crude rafters and blackened walls remained of one hut. Other looked like a face that had been caved in with a forge hammer. The villagers looked back at the counselor, buckets in hand, squinting, rubbing their burnt faces. Some of them were missing eyebrows and hair, but otherwise, everyone looked all right. "How do you fight them?" Marlowe asked, coming up to them, heart racing. "What do you normally do?" "We always just let Titanus do it," said one. But before the counselor could respond with the cynical reminder that Titanus was no longer coming to save anyone anymore, wild shrieking broke out from the other side of the village, stealing everyone's attention away from the temporary calm. They ran toward the cries, rounding a bend and coming upon the attackers struggling with some kids crouched in the sand. "Hey!" Marlowe grabbed their attention. Their shark eyes, hidden in scarves, gleamed through the night. None had hair, burned off. Marks tracked across their bodies like hefts, but theirs were splotchy and chaotic. Their claws snared kids, dug into wrists, drew blood. They pulled hard enough to tear muscle. Marlowe leapt and tackled the one in front. They both fell to the ground. He got on top, raised his fists, and brought them down on the pyro's panicked, hidden face. Except she bucked and made him miss the shot. Smoke gushed between them. The pyro wailed. Glass froze the sand from his strike. She throttled up a leg against his back, kicking the air out of him. He slumped off her like she'd kicked him in the crotch. Doused charged, but the pyros caught and took them to the ground too. Kids fled and huddled behind one of the huts, hands covering their faces as they struggled to watch. The pyro woman crawled away from Marlowe, but he hooked her ankle with his fingers. Her skin burned. She snarled at him. Her scarf came loose. Jagged teeth and cracking nostrils. Smoke seeped from behind her eyes. She kicked him. He held firm, sinking fingers into a tendon, drawing smoke, not blood, out of her leg. Her leg pistoned again. He pulled her back, but at the same time his own leg felt a tug. "No, no!" he cried, the pyro slipping from his fingers. He rolled onto his back. Some ugly, head-dented man smiled as he inflamed a fist. "Weak poly scum," he said, hammer-fisting Marlowe's stomach. The counselor jackknifed, molding around the blow and coughing like almost having drowned. His eyes bloomed with stars. Sand broke the impact of his head as it cratered and went dark. The pyro helped the woman up to her feet. They turned to the doused attacking the others, and went after them. One of the doused caught a fiery hand from the pyro. Sweat popped from his face as the hand grew hotter and closer to burying in his throat. The pyro man smiled, pushing the doused to his knees. The dowsed's arms began to quiver. Out of the corner of his eye, the pyro woman came dashing in and collided and rolled with him. She clawed his face as he thrashed on the ground. Other doused tried crawling away, nudging the children to take shelter somewhere else. Marlowe rocked his head in the sand, grit falling into his ears, sticking to the back of his neck. A figure came running in from the haze behind him. A blonde tentacle spilled out from the top of their blocky form. and in a manner only a counselor could have done, inflamed their hands and unleashed burning twins into 2 pyros, obliterating their stomachs until only a perfect circle of space remained. They stared at and probed their wounds, looking up at the figure, and then collapsed. The figure rushed to Marlowe as the doused regathered the upper hand and grabbed hold of his arm, yanking him to his feet. His vision blurred as their face clarified. "Helga? Up on your feet, Marlowe." She set him to the side as he regained his footing and went ahead, flinging fire at the pyros, knocking them down, bursting holes through their torsos. A single pyro remained, tugging on one of the children to get them to let go of the hut. Helga charged, smashing him into the wall. She snatched the child and put them on her shoulders before running with the kids to a few huts down and hiding them there. Marlowe's head spun. He clapped a hand to it to stabilize, and when he wasn't dizzy anymore, saw the crumbled pyros smoking in piles. Helga came back to him and touched his arm. "We should see if there are any more on the outskirts." But a comet, magma orange and pulsing like a dimming star, struck the ground from high in the air and obliterated sand into glass, pelting Marlowe and Helga as they blocked the debris with arms swept across their faces. The glassy vehicle split and birthed a terrific flame that lashed out like some alien making first contact. Tentacled fire flung its nucleus out into the sand, and standing above his broken fighters was none other than the same man Marlowe had been searching for since the day he left. His missing eye had been replaced with an orb of flame leaking out and scorching half of his face. "Doyle," Marlowe said, barely able to get the name out. Helga gave him a bewildered look. "You know the Homo Ignis?" "My friend since we were kids." She pointed at Doyle. "This has been the one sending pyros to kidnap our young. Been leading the effort to destroy the Taoist." The fire-headed man looked at them. "By turning your stomach to a dooming world, you destroy your culture, yourselves. Let me just finish it for you already." "Doyle!" Marlowe shouted back at him, throwing his arm toward him. The man looked back. "You embrace the fire? The pyros? What of your parents? What would they think of this, of you?" "It's not important what they thought. Brutus and Lenda are dead." He held up a fire-engulfed hand. The flame in his eye lashed out and crawled around the outside of his face like a parasite, leaving dark spots, but not charring his flesh. "I have melded and become one with the Universal. Its will flows through me, and I serve to sow the seeds of destruction of the drench and rebirth of mankind as the first of the Homo Igni." Marlowe couldn't think to say anything. How different his friend had become. The fire slipped off Doyle's hand and roped down to the dead pyros surrounding him, puncturing the holes of their burned flesh and refilling them with flame that crystallized into cauterized matter, pulling them all back up to their feet, reigniting fire in their dead eyes, and restoring their bodies with universal energy. Sulphurous gas burped from their lips, their bellies burned bright, and they turned to the Homo Ignis with clouded eyes. With the other hand, he thrust at Marlowe and Helga. The resurrected fled forward, feet flitting above the sand, fire following them like a shadow. 2 collided with Helga and Marlowe, taking them to the ground. The pyros lifted arms, legs, heads, whatever they had available, and pummeled them like mindless animals. Doyle's other pyros turned toward the doused, trying to get up, and blasted them. Doyle gazed down to the children and started toward them, sending his pyro puppets to pick up the scraps and put down any resisting villagers. Marlowe blocked blow after blow raining down on him from the unrelenting pyro husk, scoring heat marks up and down his forearms. Their faces had a sullen, dead expression, hating the life once again endowed to them, resentful of the living. Helga dealt with hers, getting on top and driving a fist into their throat. Where a normal fight would have stalled, the pyro felt nothing and delivered a haymaker to her left temple, knocking her into the sand. She caught her bruised skull as she picked herself up, but couldn't take the pyro when they moved to the advantage and mounted her and drove nails into her side. Doyle came to the kids hiding and trembling, sending the living dead pyros to smoke them out. They spilled into his path, cowering and crying. He smiled and extended a hand to the closest one. The kid looked up at him, fooled in part by his kind smile, but disturbed by the pyros moaning like the dead around them. "Come with me. I will show you a better life than this squalor." The kid looked back at his friends. "What do we do? Do we trust him?" The grown-ups said never to trust the pyros, But we have no choice. We have no way to get out of here. But the kids, before they got a chance to say, looked at the smoke pluming out from behind the door of the thirsty Sherpa's hut, where Hef eased out and hollered with sudden yelps of hope for their chief. Doyle caught sight of the Hef in the kid's eyes and turned to block the blow with his left arm. But instead of stopping it in its tracks, the thirsty Sherpa's strike cut clean through Doyle's arm and lopped it off like a branch where it hit the sand and bled fire into the grit, making glassy soup. Doyle stared at the void below his elbow and turned to the leader in shock. Hef already had another fist primed in his other hand. Doyle let go of the pyros and ducked down to his missing arm, scooped it into the air, shaped it into a spear, and froze it solid with flame. He brought it sweeping against Hef's head. But the Sherpa blocked it with his arm, shattering it over his rigid stance, and seized Doyle's head, thumbing near his inversal eye hole and letting a fire he had long held dormant in his body into Doyle's mesmerized expression. The Homo Ignis screamed when the fire burned bright between them. Marlowe managed to see the fight as Helga got the upper hand with her pyro and assisted him with his. Doyle cried, echoing memories of when he'd blown out his eye. Some desire within Marlowe felt justified, like he believed Doyle deserved this pain. Yet it was counteracted with pity, as if the boy he'd been friends with still dwelled within that monster. Doyle screamed, hating the man before him, hating that he had so much power. His good eye rolled to the other pyros, and in a slipping moment, lashed out a final stretch of flame that zipped to each pyro and tore them up from their piles and flung them into the air over to the other side of the village. Marlowe and Helga gasped at the flying people, as did Hef, who lost his focus on the power Doyle had revealed. And in that window, Doyle fell back into the sand, tore over a blanket of it atop his body, and burst with the flame to turn it into crystal that rocketed up and away from Hef, who followed it with jets of inversal fire that lit up the night. The pyros coalesced out of range on the other side of the village and flitted off into the night, turning into comets and flying off until their vague demonic stars twinkled from afar. Helga and Marlowe came back from the blackened earth where they had been fighting the horrific resurrections, breathing like they were about to pass out. Helga recovered her breath and waited for Marlowe to find his. Hef lingered on the pyro's return. His eyes glistened in the night as he went around and helped up the doused. He spoke low as the kids in hiding crept out and made their way over to him.
The Pyros have found deeper secrets hidden within the flame. Polly, your friend, the Homo Ignis, has been warring against us for countless moons, growing stronger every time. He came from your city. Remember that, as he comes to take everyone he can from us. Though tonight, it appears we were lucky.
Because of you, Marlowe said. I'm sorry. As your ambassador, that I couldn't do more.
As am I,
Hef replied. He looked at his people.
Return to bed. The morning will have its work.
He came to Marlowe, who was alone when Helga bid him good night and headed back to her hut.
You should rest,
he said.
These fights happen often.
I will. Marlowe nodded as Hef returned to his chambers. He stood alone, shaking, appalled by what his friend had become, at the missing emotion he used to have in every word he said. Didn't even recognize his friend in that fire. Wasn't even sure if Doyle did either. Or if he even cared. He threw up in the sand. Fights like this all the time. What's the point? Could they even win? With someone like Hef, maybe they could. Marlowe didn't sleep well that night.